Welcome back, and thank you to Jackie Kay for her thoughts. The theme of this year's RTS conference is Britishness. But that Britishness, in a media sense, is under threat as never before in the modern era, not only from international streamers, but from an ever more fragmented UK. To discuss the implications of this for broadcasting and for production, I am joined by a stellar panel. First, Rhodri Talfan Davies. Such are the tough times at the BBC that Rhodri has to do two jobs. He is a director of BBC Wales, and from January this year, BBC Director of Nations. He also sits in the BBC's Executive Committee. John Whiston is Managing Director of Continuing Drama in a very Game of Thrones way, head of ITV in the North. He is in charge of all the ITV's UK production and now relishes his nickname, which is the Pope of Soap. Chris is formerly the Director of Standards at Ofcom. Chris is now a media consultant, which, as many of you in this room know, means he takes your watch and he tells you what the time is. He is Channel 4's online ombudsman and sits on the Sky News Board, but is speaking today in a personal capacity. Alex Mahon is the Chief Executive of Channel 4. She was formerly the Chief Executive of Shine, and then she was Chief Executive Officer of Foundry. So as you can see, she likes being the boss. But she is actually about to face her biggest challenge ever, stopping the privatization of Channel 4. And personally, can I just say, it was totally genius of Channel 4 to get the Raducanu game at the weekend. Unbelievably brilliant. Joining us from Glasgow is the only shining knight on the panel, Britain's favourite psophologist, Professor Sir John Curtice. And unlike political parties, he is always top of the polls. So before we enter the general minefield, let's see where stands the United Kingdom now. John, opening remarks, please.
Well, of course, when devolution was restored in Scotland and in Wales in 1999, it was introduced in Scotland and Wales in 1999 and restored in Northern Ireland. It did, of course, mark the end of 30 years of political debate in Scotland and Wales, and of course, of civil strife in Northern Ireland. And for many, at least, they hoped that this move would help to ensure that actually the integrity of the United Kingdom state would no longer be under threat. The devolution settlement in Scotland and Wales was intended to ensure that the distinctive needs, aspirations, and identities of those parts of the United Kingdom were ones that the United Kingdom state could clearly accommodate. In Northern Ireland, a mixture of east-west and north-south relationships were intended to ensure that the very different identities and aspirations of those in the Protestant and nationalist communities would both be accommodated within the new power-sharing framework. One part of the UK, London accepted, that however, of course, was left largely alone, was England. But now, just over 20 years on, the truth is that despite those hopes, the UK state now seems to be under more threat than ever. In Scotland, we have an administration that is wanting to hold a second independence referendum at a time when the country seems to be divided down the middle on the subject and more polarised on it than ever before. In Northern Ireland, we seem to at least now have the possibility that the next Northern Ireland Assembly election will produce a Sinn Féin First Minister, and meanwhile the threat that perhaps the institutions will be collapsed once more is also hanging over it. In Wales, there is at least now much more talk about independence, and meanwhile, for some at least, a more nationalist England is now also less happy about the advantages that the rest of the United Kingdom enjoys. Now, so therefore, the future of the United Kingdom state is certainly as uncertain as it has been. Yet for broadcasters, the shape and the structure of the state matters. So at least three initial questions that clearly we should be considering during the course of this session. The first is, of course, is that devolution itself, as we've been used to, does create a demand for distinctive news coverage, for distinctive cultural coverage, and that can sometimes be controversial, as we've seen in some of the controversies about the coverage of the news conferences of the various devolved administrations. More broadly, however, it's the state that regulates the structure and content of state broadcasters, and therefore broadcasters are potentially not immune to political pressure from a variety of governments. But thirdly, and by no means least, of course, for territorial broadcasts at least, their territorial imprint can be very largely determined by the structure of the state. And if the territorial imprint of the United Kingdom were to change, then so also potentially does the territorial imprint of the broadcasters. Or to put it a little more colloquially, organisations like the BBC and ITV might be felt to have skin in the game in any future debates on independence in Scotland or unification in Northern Ireland. So the big question we've got to try to deal with this afternoon is how should the broadcasters, who are meant to be impartial, negotiate these potentially choppy waters?
Thank you very much, John. We'll be coming back to you in a moment. Alex, how is Channel 4 responding?
Well, the biggest response we've had is our shift to the nations and regions, which, as you know, we started about 3 years ago. And we did that in reaction to the Brexit referendum. We did it because we, like our peers, miscalled the answer to the referendum, which is not really okay as a national broadcaster. And it certainly shows that as organisations, we were generally perhaps out of touch with the mood of the country. So our switch was to think about, well, how do we stop being an organisation where the vast majority of people were in London? And how do we shift to having people represent us across the UK? And now we've got, at the end of this year, we'll have 400 roles outside of London. We've got offices in Leeds and Manchester and Glasgow and Bristol. And we're spending 50% of our money outside of London. That's what makes the difference, because you've got people with a different perspective making decisions. You haven't got people with the same perspective making all the editorial decisions. And that starts to allow us to represent better across the UK.
I mean, the joke about Brexit was that the only two people that voted for Brexit were the security guards on the door. That you were as of one mind and as of one voice.
Well, I wasn't there at the time, so I can't speak for how the building voted, but I do think in general, broadcasting called it wrong, and you have to think about what your reaction to that is.
So why not just make the leap and move your headquarters, just move everything to Leeds, leave London, and make Leeds the centre of Channel 4?
I think as you do this amount of change, like getting to 400 people, we're a small organisation, and we've done that in less than 3 years. It's only a few years since we announced we were going to do it, let alone picked places. We haven't been finished with the first stage of the plan. The news starts later this month, multiple nights a week from outside of London. Those are the changes we'll make. If we can do more later, we'll look at doing more.
John, what's ITV doing?
ITV's got regionalism in its blood, I feel. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the Granada Express, which was the train that went from Stockport at 6:35 a.m. On a Monday morning, and Granada would take over one whole carriage, and all the senior executives would get in it and go down to London for 2 or 3 days. And it was kind of like a sort of dystopian Hogwarts Express, and you'd have to have your budget examined on to the smell of sausages. But that sort of DNA, I think, has stayed with ITV all the way through. I mean, I've made 600 hours of television in the last 2 years, and the furthest south I've been is Macclesfield, and even that felt quite far south. ITV has invested a huge amount. I mean, maybe 300 million out of London spend, which is the same as BBC and Channel 4. 47% of ITV1 is made outside London. But the real clincher, I think, for ITV is that the further away you go from London, the more popular the channel is. And that's not the same for the BBC and Channel 4. So we have skin in the game in the sense of wanting to be further out of London.
You have skin in the game, but isn't that blood been really heavily diluted? I mean, in a sense, part of this is your fault. The Creative Industries and Policy Evidence Centre found that in 1991, 36.5% of TV people were in London. In 2018, it was 54.9% in London. Essentially, it's partly to do with the collapse of the ITV regions. All these different hubs of extraordinary programming.
I don't think you can blame the London-centricness on ITV. We've got something like 2,116 people working for us. Actually, probably by now 2,117. We employ about 2,500 more just in sort of other.
But it is
freelance
still a
jobs.
fraction of what it was.
I think yes, you have some decision making in.
It is a fraction of what it was.
Well, I wouldn't say so. I mean, we make 3,500 hours of television. I mean, there's a great report that Mediathek do which has now become my mastermind subject, and I can be tested on it. Mastermind, actually, which is a series that I thought I'd cancelled. I actually remember telling Magnus Magnusson that I'd cancelled it. But that was how good I am at commissioning. You know. But, you know, ITV has this regionalism in its DNA. It may have decision-making in London, but London, it's less important now post-pandemic. I mean, there's a propinquity, there's some nepotism.
Only John Whiston would use the word propinquity.
Well,
in RTS
I just think that, you know, that sort of, you don't have to be in the room to get a commission these days. I mean, I've spent the last 2 years on Zoom, and it's worked perfectly well, and I think it's a real force for regionalisation, the kind of the pandemic in an odd sort of way. That's my view.
The BBC response?
I think the BBC has been adapting to the sort of changing nature of the UK for the best part of a quarter of a century. I think if you track back to the referenda that John was referring to in '97, and you look at the way the BBC has redistributed itself across the UK and decentralised, you know, we have 8,500 staff now outside the M25. We're investing.
Yeah, but a lot of the decision-making is still made by people in London going to the same dinner parties.
Well, there's been a phenomenal shift in you take commissioning as one example, and something we announced earlier this year. You know, bringing the nation's commissioners, the commissioning teams we have in Wales, Scotland, Ireland, to the heart of decision-making about what we put on network television. These are significant shifts. £150 million a year being spent on network television in 3 devolved nations, £500 million on local and regional services across the UK. So these have been profound shifts. I think the other point is it's not just about pounds and pence. I think if you talk about that sort of seminal referendum in 2014, and you look at the story of the BBC in Scotland since then, the development of the channel, you know, beaten all the targets it's been set. You look at the role of the Nine now in terms of journalistic
But it's fair to
curiosity.
say that you got a fright in 2014. BBC got a fright.
I don't think the BBC got a fright. I mean, when I looked at the breadth of the output in 2014, and I look at both the journalists in BBC Scotland, the journalists in network television, you know, I thought that was phenomenal coverage. You don't get everything perfect in a moment of that scale. But it's interesting. If you go to the Ofcom report that came out a couple of weeks ago, and you look at Scotland, you know, what's the most valued news service, television news service in Scotland? It's BBC One. What's the most valued radio news service in Scotland? It's Radio Scotland. BBC Online, the top site. So yes, of course, it was bumpy. There was incoming. It was highly polarised. But if you look at the track record and the trust we continue to have in Scotland, that's a real achievement.
Chris, what do you make of this?
Well, I think the difficulty for potentially independent countries going forward is that, as we've heard, international and global content is becoming more and more, and these smaller nations will be asking for more cultural televisions and greater output at the same time as everything is becoming more global. So you'll have potentially smaller broadcasters, less of them, and a government wanting to have a regulator that demands more regional or national, as it will be then, content. That's going to be really difficult.
Yeah. Well, let's talk more in detail about Scotland. John Curtice, as Shakespeare might have said in Macbeth, stand Scotland where it did.
Frankly not. We're already in a position where there is a continuing debate about whether or not there should be an independence referendum. The Scottish Parliament made a request for another referendum following the result of the Brexit referendum as long ago as March 2017, though of course it is a request that both Theresa May and subsequently Boris Johnson have cold-shouldered. However, we have to remember that in the May 2021 Scottish Parliament election, basically pretty much everybody who's in favour of independence voted for the SNP, and pretty much everybody who's in favour of independence wants another referendum, at least at some point in the next 5 years. And it is frankly, it's going to be as difficult for Nicola Sturgeon not to pursue an independence referendum as it would have been for Boris Johnson not to have pursued Brexit in the wake of his success in December 2019. So the truth is that this issue is going to come to the fore. But it's an issue where the legal position is perhaps rather less clear than people sometimes think. It's not entirely clear as to whether or not it is impossible for the Scottish Parliament to hold a referendum on its own volition, on its own authority, rather than relying on the process that was used in 2014, i.e. and Section 30 order from the UK Parliament. This is where certainly if the SNP government was willing to ask a different question from the one that was asked in 2014, public lawyers disagree as to whether or not there's a possibility of finding a wording that would pass the scrutiny of the UK Supreme Court. So against this already active dispute about the future of the UK state, I think three obvious challenges potentially face the broadcasters. Number one is if, as seems likely, there is a legal challenge at some point in the future, how do they cover this effectively and partially in what will be a highly partisan political environment? Secondly, what if the Scottish Parliament were to succeed in passing the scrutiny of the UK Supreme Court? But, for example, perhaps there is a unionist boycott of the ballot. What coverage should such a referendum be given? What status should it be accorded? And then thirdly, and by no means least, if indeed by whatever means, either Section 30 or non-Section 30, a ballot is held, the truth is that a lot of the arguments that were deployed in 2014 have moved on, not least because of Brexit, because of the pandemic, and because of the decline in the price and in the importance of oil. So how will the broadcasters ensure that the public are indeed adequately exposed to the different arguments from both sides in the debate while maintaining their impartiality?
John, thank you very much. Coming back to you, Rhodri, this is a nightmare for the BBC because as well as being an observer, you're a participant, you have got B in your name.
Well, I think the approach we took in 2014 gives us, I think, a lot of pointers to a future potential referendum. I think the BBC was very clear in 2014. It wasn't going to enter the policy debate. It was for the yes campaign and for the no campaign to set out their views of how broadcasting would work in a post-referendum situation. And the BBC would focus on why we're here, which is to tell it straight. And to make sure our journalistic response in terms of its, the ambition, in terms of both the integrity of our networked news services and our services in BBC Scotland, just to nail that. And it'll be for others to make the decision. I don't believe the BBC is going to set out any view as to what is where the organisational self-interest of the corporation might sit. It has to focus on the journalistic mission.
However, you'll remember the protests outside the BBC, and the truth is in Scotland that many people who were in those protests saw the BBC as unionist.
I think John puts his finger on the challenge facing broadcasters. It'll be about journalistic self-confidence. It'll be any vote of this sort of binary nature is going to be colossally polarizing. But you cannot measure the journalistic quality of what you're doing by the scale of incoming that you get on this story or that. You have to hold your nerve, and that is where the journalistic challenge lies.
But in terms of BBC strategy and policy, what was the scenario planning? There must have been presumably scenario planning in 2014 about...
We took a very clear view.
No, I don't mean publicly, but it must have been in the executive, there must have been some scenario planning.
No, there was no formal work undertaken at all in 2014 in terms of the various constitutional outcomes. And we've seen with Brexit...
But was that not a dereliction of duty?
Well, we've seen with Brexit. We had a referendum in 2016. We got an outcome 3.5 years later. In any situation with a referendum in Scotland, whatever the outcome, there will be a significant process that follows it. And that is the point at which any discussion around the future shape of broadcasting would take place. The difficulty is, if the BBC has or sets out any policy in terms of potential shapes of broadcasting post-referendum, you compromise the confidence and the space in which your journalists operate.
Chris, what are the regulatory issues if Scotland were to become independent?
I think they're very significant. The Scottish government or future Scottish government would have to think, does it want a state regulator? I presume it does. Therefore, does it have a licensing regime? I presume it does. There's a whole load of architecture. Which channels will it have oversight over? What PSB requirements, news, drama, regional output, etc.
Would it be a license fee?
Will there be a license fee? I mean, BBC Scotland, does BBC Scotland stay? Does England, Wales and Northern Ireland, if they're still part of a fractured United Kingdom, pay for a Scottish BBC? Does Scotland BBC? I mean,
well, it wouldn't be a Scottish BBC, would it? Would just...
No, but who knows? I mean, what happens to Channel 4, which is a national broadcaster? What happens to their output? I mean, there is so much architecture around broadcasting, and it is a very, inverted commas, regulated environment. That takes years, and it doesn't surprise me if the BBC didn't do a lot of planning. Well, you could also argue that the Scottish government, had they decided whether they wanted a Scotcom or something?
Alex, Scotcom.
I don't know, I just made that up.
What would Channel 4 do in that event?
Well, first I'd Google what a Section 30 order is, so that I'd work out the answer to that. I mean, we're not preparing for that, and it's not our job to take a position on that, just like the BBC were impartial on it. I would say you've got to ask the question what the audience is looking for. I think the audience is looking for perspectives that play to their own experience and their own voices and their own lifestyles. They're not looking for that all to be done from the south. I mean, I can say that having grown up in Scotland. But at the same time, young people feel a decreasing sense of Britishness. You kind of heard it in that introduction, but the survey says that only 36% of 16 to 24s in the UK feel a strong sense of Britishness, and that is higher in England than it is in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland. So we see those differences, but I don't think we see a demand from the audience to only see content from smaller and smaller areas. They want a diversity of perspectives to be put into things and to see a range of content. So I think our questions would be about how do you react to that? Because it's not about getting into smaller and smaller pots and smaller areas. Our strategy is to bring the same thing to the whole of the UK, but do it from different places.
I mean, you could run a split service. Run a split service for advertising anyway.
I'm sure you could, but that's not what we're planning for at the moment.
No.
It becomes more expensive, though, doesn't it?
Well, yes.
If a Scottish government or a Scottish regulator is asking for specific Scottish content, they would want more Scottish content, wouldn't they? That's the whole point of independence. You have more Scottishness. And that means more expense in a place where public service broadcasting is being cut. So there's a sort of an irony or a dichotomy there. That's really difficult.
And it's often about making things smaller. I mean, I hate to be in the business.
But it makes things smaller. But I mean, you look at somewhere like Denmark. It's not that they're just doing Danish programs. They're doing programs with the international perspective as well. I mean, they're serving the nation in different ways.
Yes, but it's quite, having run a Danish production company, it's quite difficult to raise the funding for that. You've got to go all over the place to try and get the money together. For the reason The Bridge was a show about a body split in two between two countries, we had to raise the money.
Yeah.
And there's only so many things. There's only so many times you can do that. And it doesn't look as good if you do that in Gretna Green, trust me. But, I mean, I hate to agree too much with ITV. That will be in the business of bigging them up. But John is totally right about the changes that have happened through the pandemic about geo-leveling, of people being treated the same when they're pitching by Zoom, no matter where they come from. I mean, that's a good difference.
I mean, the word du jour is leveling up. And, in political terms, that's one thing, but also in media terms, it's a massive kind of leveling up. And that's the idea. But, John, I suppose you'd say this is actually STV's problem or STV's opportunity. Yeah,
in some ways. But I mean, when I grew up, the 5 most dreaded words in the English language were "except for viewers in Scotland." You'd be watching a BBC programme and it'd say, now there's this brilliant programme, except for viewers in Scotland. And you'd get a sort of a documentary about the fishing industry in Stornoway, probably something
which is hugely important.
Which I probably made, or we probably made.
We probably made.
And then, therefore, it comes back down to the economics of it, which is what I worry about. I mean, obviously, everybody has their views about nationalism. When England was playing Italy in the Euros, there was a pasta and pizza night in my local pub, and I had a big moral.
In Tinnabrook?
This is in Tinnabrook, and this I had a big moral decision as to whether I could actually go to it or not, because there's fun nationalism and there's dangerous nationalism, and I think we're all aware of that. But actually, for broadcasters, it comes down to the economics of it, and what I what I think we can do, we're not, ITV won't take a side on whether Scotland should be independent or not. But what it will do is warn that if you break up the nation, if you fragment the nation too much, then who's going to pay for these programs? How are they going to get paid for? How are we going to have the sort of wealth that we've created? I mean, we're actually victims of our own success because people now expect much more localism, they expect much more nationalism, and they expect much more globalization. And so we've created this sort of very, very rich TV environment, but going forward, it's quite hard to see how it's going to be paid for.
Well, maybe it's actually finally time for ITV to buy STV.
I couldn't speculate on anything like that, just as I wouldn't speculate on ITV buying Channel 4. That wouldn't be anything that we could foresee. It's a hypothetical. We are where we are. I think we bought UTV and things are going really well there. Emmerdale, for example, is incredibly popular in Northern Ireland.
Who knew?
Who knew? But it is. They get mobbed in the streets over there.
Well, we should definitely talk about Northern Ireland. So back to John of the thorny issue of the potential border poll in Ireland. John.
Well, Kirsty, unlike the position in Scotland, there is already a legal position that potentially paves the way for a border poll on Northern Ireland's status. The Secretary of State has, if the Secretary of State is satisfied that there appears to be majority support for unification, then he or she is under a legal obligation to hold a border poll. Now, the truth is, the polls in Northern Ireland are not in full agreement about exactly how much support there is for unification, but for the time being, at least, a majority of them still suggest that remaining inside the United Kingdom is still the more popular option. So there doesn't look to be much immediate prospect of a border poll. However, Brexit and its fallout has fractured the unionist community in Northern Ireland. It's now politically divided between the DUP, the UUP and the TUP. The Alliance Party is also doing relatively well amongst Protestants, and one consequence of that is that support for Sinn Féin, although it's perfectly stable, is now currently outpacing that for any of the unionist parties, which raises the prospect that the next First Minister of Northern Ireland could be from Sinn Féin, and therefore from a party that in the lifetimes of some of us was once banned from the airwaves of the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, of course, that difficulty that Brexit has caused the unionist community, and for the DUP in particular, has now led to the threat from the current DUP leader that perhaps the institutions will be collapsed once again. And of course, it may be the case that the UK government doesn't allow the election to go ahead, but again suspends the institutions. Both those scenarios create challenges for the broadcasters. If indeed the official representative of Northern Ireland and of government in Northern Ireland is from Sinn Féin, how do the broadcasters ensure that a person does indeed get adequate and fair coverage, given that perhaps that person may occasionally lace their comments and their pronouncements with rather critical remarks about the Union and about the United Kingdom, remarks that perhaps the United Kingdom government will not find particularly helpful. Secondly, if indeed the institutions were to be collapsed, how then do we ensure that the views of Northern Ireland politicians are adequately and fairly represented by the broadcasters when it's not clear who actually speaks for Northern Ireland, but when there are important decisions still to be made for Northern Ireland, not least about the pandemic and not least about Brexit. And then, of course, if Scotland does hold a ballot, and maybe Scotland were to vote yes, then probably the pressure for a unification poll would increase, maybe support for unification increases. And in those circumstances, the first phase would be, in a sense, where we are now in Scotland, a debate about whether or not the legal requirements for a border poll have indeed been satisfied, and look forward to another requirement to try to negotiate the shoals of a politically contentious debate where doubtless the argument, not least from opinion polls, will be argued and chewed over quite extensively.
Gosh, Chris, but the implications in Scotland are pretty complex. What are the implications, do you think, for for United Ireland for
I
broadcast?
think they're a bit simpler. There is already, I think it's called BAI, the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland. It will be a country that's fully in the EU. It will have to comply with all the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, and it will be, like France or Denmark or wherever else, a country outside of, do I use the word United Kingdom or Britain? It'll be a country outside of Britain. So I think the other thing I'd be quite interested, John has mentioned a number of times the concerns about impartiality for broadcasters. And if I were a broadcaster sitting in this panel, and I thought, since none of them have actually
There's still time.
I'd say, well, they have to negotiate these sorts of issues every day. Sometimes they're more complicated, sometimes they're less complicated. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes perhaps they get it wrong. But I don't necessarily see this any more difficult than lots and lots of issues they have to deal with. They may get it wrong more, but they got things wrong in other areas which are controversial.
And a Sinn Féin First Minister, the idea that discussions about the union would be perhaps problematic, presumably an impartiality of news would still have to exist.
Absolutely, and I think that compared to some of the issues during the 70s, 80s in Northern Ireland, I think would be, do I say, relatively simple compared to some of the issues they've had to deal with before.
Well, you are a broadcaster, Alex, so what do you think you would do if there was a United Ireland?
I think you would use all the same rules on due impartiality that we use every day. I mean, I agree with Chris on that. And the news teams are very experienced at doing that. I still think when you go for us, the question of separate feeds, do you cover the country? We'd still be trying to make content that the broadest range of audiences are interested in. So just as Emmerdale is very popular outside of where it's made, Dairy Girls for us is super popular across the UK and across the world, right? It's more popular outside of London than it is in London, which is interesting. It's massively popular in Scotland. So we'd be trying to work out what are the shows that can be made that are interesting to the broadest range of people and why, because they're not about the smaller and smaller.
But for instance, the BBC will, I would imagine, continue to be broadcast in Ireland, but they won't have to pay for it. But people in Ireland will want to see it, and that will create its own little tensions, you see. And there are lots of, there'll be the same sort of different issues, but with UTV, etc. Do you know what I mean? So there will be these tensions. And I think the licence fee is particularly
Well, before I come to Rhodri, just to stick with Alex for a minute, I mean, would you set up an S4C for Ireland?
I've no idea. But what we'd want to do is make enough advertising money in the region, and to do that, we'd have to have stuff that was popular enough. So for me, it goes back to what do the audiences want to watch. To the other's point, I don't think you can fund lots of programming that's just for a smaller and smaller region. That is why programming did move out of regional broadcast licenses, because it wasn't affordable.
Rhodri, if the UK becomes GB, what does the BBC do?
Well, again, like the answer I gave on Scotland, I'm afraid I'm going to be a little quiet on that point, because I think these are hypotheticals that you deal with at that time. I do want to just pick up on Chris's point, because I think it's key. BBC Northern Ireland teams have been juggling with this stuff, really intense life and death stuff, for decades. They're making daily judgments about how to get that balance right. And it's fascinating, if you go into the BH building in Belfast, both communities, politicians from both communities, regard that as the safe space. That is the space where the democratic debate can happen. It's a unique role that the BBC plays on the ground. And I do want to just challenge, I get the efficiency point about local programming, but the bond that BBC Northern Ireland has with its audience there is partly because it doesn't just explore the issues through the prism of news. It can explore it through comedy, it can explore it through satire, and it can do that uniquely and bring both communities together.
Sure, but if there was a border poll and there wasn't eventually a United Ireland, where would the role for the BBC be on that island?
Well, I go back to what John said. I think we're some way away from that. I mean, what we're seeing at the moment is some polling that suggests that most view a border poll may come at some point, but support for reunification at the moment, I think, is in the 30 to 40% territory. So I think we're some point off any scenario of that kind.
John, you already own Ulster TV. Well, not personally, obviously, but what would the plan be?
I don't think, we're not scenario planning for the fragmentation of Britain. What we are concerned about is that Jonathan Van Tam made a really weird analogy last night when he was talking about the pitching your tent halfway up a mountain and having guy ropes and all that kind of thing. And I was thinking about it, and actually, we are halfway up a mountain, whether that mountain is Snowdon or Ben Nevis or Scafell Pike. We're halfway up that mountain with the force of the streamers coming at us. What I think we need to be doing is to be tying down those guy ropes so that we're in a good state if that fragmentation does happen, because the fragmentation is going to mean less money, inevitably, I would have thought.
Well, John, you're going to be up again now because football didn't quite make it home this summer, but we did see a strong outpouring of English pride. So I wonder what the implications of this are. You're an Englishman in Scotland, and how does it look for you?
Sorry, Kirsty. Well, the interesting thing that struck me at the beginning of your conversation with your panel was that immediately the first thing to be mentioned was the outcome of the Brexit referendum and the divergence in particular between the outcome in London and indeed in a number of university towns and elsewhere in England, and the feeling that perhaps therefore as a result the broadcasters misjudged the mood of England. Now, the truth is, there are those who claim, as I said at the beginning, that there's a resurgent English nationalism in England, partly reflected through the Brexit referendum, but also, according to some, also reflected in concern about the privileges and advantages enjoyed by the devolved nations. Now, I have to say to you, this is actually pretty contested territory. Indeed, the Bennett Institute at the University of Cambridge, where you are sitting, indeed came up with some research yesterday that said, well, it's not entirely clear that this picture is correct. So in a sense, the first challenge indeed to the broadcasters, which they've already acknowledged, is, well, how to negotiate and reflect England's sense of itself when that may well vary across England, and when also, in truth, how England thinks of itself is indeed the subject of some dispute. But then the other thing to say about England, which sharply differentiates it from the position in the other three devolved nations, is that when it comes to the constitutional debate, it's a very different debate. There's more than one option. Do people in England, if they want a change, do they want an English parliament? Do they want regional assemblies? Do they want city regions with or without elected mayors? Or do they just want English votes for English laws, albeit the UK Parliament has just got rid of that? And the truth is, quite a lot of the debate about devolution in England is not really about who should have the ability to make laws and to make central government decisions. It also often looks like a debate about the reform and restructuring of local government. Now, that said, even if what you do is to create regional institutions, we've seen during the pandemic how that can be a recipe for conflict and dispute between spokespersons of regional organizations and the central government. But the difficulty perhaps, however, for the broadcasters here is that, in a sense, is that because the debate in England is fragmented, that the institutional change is often very piecemeal. We've just seen it introduced in Yorkshire, but it's been going on in Manchester for quite some time, that perhaps it's not always entirely clear what is the role for network news for covering the debate about how England is governed, as opposed to the role for regional news. But that does therefore mean that perhaps the wider debate in England is at risk of not being adequately served. Meanwhile, of course, another crucial question to ask about England, and in a sense it almost inevitably takes us back to Scotland. If indeed we do have a ballot at some point in Scotland, there will be the important question of not only how is this covered within Scotland, but also how should it best be covered in England. And I think one of the disputes that came out of the 2014 referendum is who is best placed to do that. Is it journalists in Scotland who are perhaps better attuned to the issue, or is it journalists based in England who perhaps understand the needs and requirements of the audience south of the border better? And maybe that's something that this time will need to be thought through a little more carefully.
Rhodri, can you pick that up?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I think probably the answer is both. I think any referendum, particularly that took place in Scotland, has clearly profound implications for all parts of the UK. So the journalistic response needs to happen nationwide. I do think I think John's put his finger on it, I do think the dimensions of English nationalism or English identity, whatever we want to call it, are different. The issue of regional inequality plays, and sort of inequity plays much larger. And I think that what we're seeing in the West Midlands, what we're seeing in the northwest of England and in the northeast are very, very powerful articulations of regional identity. Yeah. And clearly, we're in a very fortunate position. We have a regional network of news. We have a local radio network. We have that canvas on which to tell those quite nuanced stories.
But that's interesting, because I think that whole levelling up agenda, you know, is there a kind of resentment, John, in the north about what the south has? And you can say that's reflected regionally, but what actually in a national terms in England are you getting to hear what some of the disgruntlement is in the north, John?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot more unity than disunity. I mean, that's what we trade on in the soap, certainly. You know, we kind of, we find those stories that are about the social issues that are difficult social issues, but actually in the end kind of quite unite people, because they deep down people are similar. They're all Jack Tamson's bairns, as the Macker might say. So I don't think that, you know, I don't see this kind of north-south divide quite in that way. I mean, what I do see is that politicians have used the pandemic in a way to slightly split the nation. I mean, you know, you'd get sort of very slightly different rules in Scotland, Wales, etc. I think the nadir for me...
actually serve their nation.
Yes, well,
split their nation.
Well, except that I think, you know, they would say that they're based on the epidemiology of their particular nation, but actually, wasn't there something in there that about serving the nationalist cause in terms of saying, right, okay, we're different.
Well, that's interesting. That is a very political statement.
Yeah, it is a political statement, but at the same time, what I would say is that as national broadcasters, as people who you know, have people's eyeballs during the pandemic, what we did was we stayed on air with daytime, we stayed on air with the soaps, we stayed on air with news, and we served a kind of a sense that Britain needed the PSBs at that time to kind of reflect what was going on, and that was really important at that time. And I think you know, if you'd watched the streamer at that time, you wouldn't have even known that there was a pandemic on unless you'd, you know, Googled for the pandemic film. So, you know, I think it was really important what the PSBs did during that time, and they were a force for unity. Now, what I think I'm saying is that that's problematic in a way for the nations, because they're actually about, if they're going to get this sort of referendum, if they're going to get nationalism in Scotland through, then it's probably more about disunity than unity. And you know, that's an interesting debate.
Alex, Ender's analysis. Londoners produce the most television, they watch it least, and are happiest with their portrayal.
I don't think you can blame me for that, personally. But, I mean, go ahead, let's lighten this up. What do I think? I think just there's a few threads in there about what people feel, right? So people want representation, and they want recognition, and they want opportunity. They want to know what's going on in their region, but they don't necessarily want regional parochialism in smaller and smaller places. And that is what we saw in the pandemic. They want to know what was going on in the whole country or nation or whatever we're calling it now. The point is, how do you get them that representation and recognition of their voice and their perspective in programs that are interesting enough and broad enough with themes that can go across all of the UK? And for us, you know, when we're covering Scottish stories, we're covering it from the Scottish Bureau for the national news. We're small enough that we can make that decision. We can do it that way. We don't have all the needs to service of the BBC. But as we do programs, we've got to think about that. The most recent things we're doing in Scotland are Murder Island, which is a big factual murder show with Ian Rankin, which is in the Inner Hebrides, but will be broadcast to all of the UK. We're doing Scottish Trauma, which is about heli medics going across Scotland. And we're doing Screw, which is a big drama series with STV in a prison. We're doing those as big pieces out of Scotland, but they're not parochial Scottish stories. That's what I see as our job. There's representation, there's recognition, but it's not parochial. And our industry's changing because people want from other places to be able to have big jobs and not just to have to come to London for them. That's the difference.
Just challenge slightly on that. I mean, the notion that national programming for Wales or Scotland is parochial. There are entirely distinctive policy agendas going on in each country which are not necessarily tied to nationalism. COVID was probably the most singular point of difference that we've seen in the last 20 years.
But do you subscribe to John's view that the reason that there were different responses was essentially to stoke disunity?
No, I don't. I mean, private motivations of individual politicians we could have a separate panel on. But I don't doubt for a second that in terms of the policy decisions that were taken in Wales, which I was closest to at the time, those were ministers and civil servants in the same way as they were in Westminster, trying to grapple with the best way of interpreting data. I think to simply assume that the only motivation on COVID restrictions in the devolved nations was to piss off London, I think that's...
I didn't say it was the only motivation, but I think it perhaps was at the back of some people's minds. Yeah.
I think representing Englishness for British broadcasters is problematic because it's so wrapped up with Britishness and Englishness. Now, you know, for Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, 1999 was a big moment. It took them years to actually understand the not in Scotland, NHS or whatever, and it took them a long time to get there. But they are really there in terms of, and I think COVID has really created an understanding that things happen very differently. But for England, there is not that same identity, but it's been created now.
Well, we're getting it from Gareth Southgate tomorrow anyway, but let's just look at this with you, Chris. There's a new book co-authored by the Welsh academic Richard Wynne-Jones on Englishness. And interestingly, that book says there is anger about England's place in the UK, that the Celtic nations are actually now getting preferential treatment.
I'm sure that's true, and I think that wraps up into what John is talking about, the Brexit debate, and a feeling of Englishness now that didn't quite exist before. And I would imagine that the England is now divided into people who feel British first, English second, and English first, British second. I think I've got no evidence for it whatsoever. I'd imagine that's changed.
Well, as a new man living in Edinburgh, how do you think about it?
I'm very confused as a new man, as an English man living in Scotland. I can't work out who to support, whether I'm English, whether I'm Scottish, whether I'm British. Before I went there, I was British English. Now, British Scottish, Scottish British. I'm very confused.
Well, just to add to the confusion, we have a last conversation with John, and it's about Wales.
Well, of course, there's no doubt that there's much more discussion about Wales's constitutional position in the last 2 or 3 years. The organisational growth of Ias Cymru has certainly raised the debate at elite level. That said, however, the opinion polls indicate it's still, independence at least, is still very much a minority preference within Wales. The language question, of course, is still potentially divisive for the nationalist movement. And so far, at least, in contrast to position in Scotland, the Labour Party seems able to reach across the constitutional divide, secure support from those who have different views about how Wales should be governed, and thereby maintain its dominant position. So to that extent, at least immediately, it's less obvious that the issue is as pressing. Still, there is that elite level debate. So I think in a sense, the big question for Wales is, well, how much time should be addressed to what at the moment still looks a relatively remote possibility? Is it important to cover it? Because after all, the idea of Welsh independence has not really been discussed very much until now. Or is it in fact still premature to do so? It might be interesting for the chattering classes in Wales, in Cardiff and in Aberystwyth, but perhaps it is not yet one for national broadcasting within Wales.
Well, Rhodri, you are part of the chattering classes in Wales, I have to say. Is there a danger that in Wales, the BBC leads the debate rather than reflects it? I mean, you've got this brilliant, shiny new building, your presence, there's lots going for you in Wales.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's the BBC's role to lead these debates. I mean, we shouldn't lag them, but we have to keep pace with them. I think John's analysis is spot on. I think there's no doubt the polls have shifted in terms of sentiment on independence, but it's not yet a high-ranking issue. So when we look at the election results, We don't see it as a primary driver of the vote, much beyond the sort of the Plaid
So how do you
Cymru
identify
constituency.
yourself?
How do I identify myself? Personally, Welsh and British. My children are Welsh and English. My nephews are Welsh and Danish. So it's a Malone.
Alex, is S4C your get out of jail card in this one, though?
In what way?
Well, I mean, your presence there, you can deal with anything that's coming your way.
S4C is nothing to do with Channel 4.
It's kind of identified with you.
It has nothing to do with Channel 4. It's part of BBC War. It's
God, I'm terribly sorry, I got that completely wrong. How did I not know that?
I wouldn't want to find out here it's mine. That would be like I tell you, I've got enough on, Kirsty, to find out that I had a Welsh broadcast operation that I've never paid any attention to.
I think there's a broadcast operation up for grabs in Guernsey. I think you should just go for that one right
maybe.
now.
Maybe that's the answer. Maybe that's the gap.
Maybe that's your
no.
next
It's
move.
a common misconception that it's somehow to do with Channel 4, but it's not.
And I should quickly add, Kirsty, S4C is proudly independent. It's not part of the BBC.
Nobody knows what S4C. John, is there a domino effect, do you think, that if Scotland were to go, do you think there's a sense, just personally, do you think there's a sense that Wales would, as it were, up its game on the national front?
I think I think we've seen, because of the pandemic, things edging there. And you know, don't get me wrong, I mean, I think if you're in those individual countries, your politicians were making you feel safer than other people, and that's quite a good thing. For me, the nadir was when I'd packed my car ready to go to my house in Scotland, which I hadn't been to for 9 months, and I was in Manchester, and Nicola Sturgeon declared that no one from Manchester should go to Scotland. It felt very personal.
Well, actually, it was directed at you personally.
It was just at me, I think. But no, I mean, you know, I come back to what Alex was saying, which is it's kind of about representation, really. People want to be represented on a big stage. I mean, you know, ITV did the Pembrokeshire murders, which started as a sort of local news story. It got 12.5 million, a huge reach for a drama. And you know, we've done that right across Britain. We make Shetland for the BBC up in Shetland. We've done Vera out of the northeast. And I mean, I remember with Vera, I was at the very first read-through for it, and it was in the Swan Hunter boardroom. And all round you had this ancient industry that was dying, and all the boats that they sent around the world. And we did the read-through there, and this was a new industry taking over from an old industry. And I was just thinking, you know, Vera has probably sold to all those countries that those boats went to. And it's a rather incredible thing. That,
circular.
You know, how do you manage to keep a British economy with kind of global aspiration and global scale? And that's, I think, what we all have to protect.
But finally, Chris, do you think the streamers are just laughing at this conversation and thinking it's incredibly parochial, given how little young people watch anything other than streamers?
Yes.
So we're doomed, essentially.
I don't think we're doomed, because I think people always want to watch programs about themselves, about their own region. You know, the very fact what Netflix does in creating programs about, you know, sex education or whatever about the UK, I think, or even Scotland and Wales, etc. So I don't think we're doomed, but I do think that actually, particularly, you know, people of, you know, kids of 16 to 25 or older, do you know what? They'll watch anything as long as it's good. It's as simple as that. And that might involve, you know, parts of the UK. It might not.
But identity doesn't matter as much to them then, in that sense.
I don't think that. My view is, I don't think they have national identity in the same way. They have identity around other things, which I don't. The BBC person here, I'm not going to get involved in.
Yeah. Very quickly on young people.
Well, I think. I mean, John's the expert on this. I think what we see, particularly when we look at the numbers on, for example, support for Welsh independence or Scottish independence, actually they skew younger. Yeah. So identity is critical, but in the end, it's about high quality programming. That's their criteria for selection. But identity plays very, very significantly for younger audiences.
Well, I'd like you to thank both John and also our panel here for that session. Thanks very much indeed.